Oh no.
Okay, so here we are, Codecraft. We are going to be talking today about factory method, prototype, and Singleton. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That's good. So, I read through obviously chapter, looked at, read through each one of the things, and I was like, okay, I see his examples and such, and he's like pulling examples from these esoteric pieces of software, giving small talk examples and whatnot. And I'm like, okay, so I want to double check, make sure I do understand the pattern, that I haven't missed something in it. And so then I go and I saw that refactoring guru guy, and I start reading that. And I'm like, this is way more understandable. So it makes me think that maybe this book, as great as it is aged out. Like it's from 1994 and was revelatory in 1994, but we're almost at 30 years since this thing came out. And while they are the original source, these four guys that put this book together, other people may be better at explaining it than the original four guys. Like, we've had 30 years in which to improve, right? And so I'm starting to wonder if we could still follow the table of contents of the book, but not necessarily need to read this book. So what do you think, Tyler?
Well, from my experience, and maybe I'm just of a younger generation, but I find that book very difficult to read and comprehend. To me, it's very dense and very wordy. And so I often have found that I'm always going online anyways, even in pair with the book, trying to understand it in different ways. And so I've resulted with this website, this guru website. I'm tending to finding myself going there anyways, and then that is where I'm getting the click or the revelation of oh, that's what this is. So from my experience, that website has been way better in helping me understand what's going on than the books. I think that there is value in books and the original creators, but I'm not connecting with that book, and I'm struggling to just sit down and read that book. But going on that website, personally I found way nicer, for myself at least.
Yeah, and there's definitely a time and place for suck it up. It's hard, so it is an academic book, right? Like these guys clearly come from writing academic papers and such. So there's definitely hard books are sometimes hard, and that's good, and we need to learn the discipline, and you'll find the juice if you keep squeezing. But in this particular case, I don't think so. I really don't think that there's any value to the difficulty of the book. I think it's getting in the way.
I think the other thing is this was a conversation starter on this original book. I think it's started a conversation which has kept on going. Because you look at, there's hundreds of blog posts and there's reprintings of design pattern books. In college I went through a Java text which went through, I think there's probably only 12 of the patterns. But it was looking in depth at those patterns and seeing how they kept on getting used. And so I think there's something to be said for, this is great, but this is only where it started. Even their introduction, they're this is not the definitive list. We hope that you guys are adding more patterns. You need to get the patterns for AR or the patterns for whatever. Just adding it in.
Yeah, I think the format is not the best for a practical use case. And that's what you see in a lot of academic text, is it's people who understand the field really well having conversations, and I think that this is some of what this is. So it makes it really hard as a beginner coming to it. I still feel like I read those 3 chapters and I still don't really understand why I use one over the other, or the benefits that they really provide. I've read the benefits and I could probably, don't ask me to, but I could probably tell you one over the other, but I don't functionally understand why I would want to use one over the other. And I think that's common for academic texts when you're not the at the cutting edge. I think that's common.
Okay. So we don't have to read the book anymore. We'll just continue on with Refactor Guru.
Yay.
In a particular sequence. Oh, Zach's been holding back.
No, it's just like when I think it's the like known uses and the examples part where I find my eyes start to glaze over when it starts talking about like all of these applications and technologies. I'm like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, you don't use Unidraw on Unix, and
I know it's surprising, but yeah, I know I haven't.
Dude,
you
that's
haven't
so
been programming in
surprising.
Smalltalk in order to be able to read these examples.
Yeah, I know I'm unmasking myself as a fraud by reading that, but
What you go to school for? Music?
oh no, they know.
Oh no!
No, they know.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So there you go. That's my big revelation. Okay, so factory method.
Very similar to abstract. Factory.
Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you or understand.
Oh. It's very similar to abstract factory.
Okay.
I thought you were gonna whisper it then, Tyler. I was about like, what's going on?
Yeah. You got into ASMR mode there, but then didn't do it.
Yeah. I need a second mic, like one or something.
To be honest, I don't understand the difference between abstract factory and factory method, really. Like, I don't know. We did talk about it a bit before, but I still feel like I don't really understand, again, why you'd use one over the other.
Yeah. So I don't know what it's like for you guys to read it. I only know what it's like for me to read it, obviously. And I read this back in 99, 2000, right? It was relatively new. There was nothing else. It was just this book for design patterns because it got the conversation going. And we now live in an era that has been influenced by this book. So you're like reading factory method and you're like, what's the big deal? Like, why am I reading a chapter about factory method? I use this all the time when I'm doing Unity and whatever, right? And yeah, that's kind of the answer. That's why I'm saying, like, maybe this book from 30 years ago isn't the best description anymore, because at the time they were like, hey, this is really new. And now you're like, yeah, I'm familiar with this. So I'm not grokking what's so special, and I feel like there should be something special, and I'm not seeing anything special, right? And the same thing with Singleton. When I just read the Singleton thing, I was reading it because it's been a long time since I read it, and I was like, is there anything new or different that I may have missed? I've made plenty of Singletons. You know, we have the game Singleton in Archmage. You know, is there something there? And the answer is nope. It's exactly as I remember and as I expected and as you've seen, right? And now, you remember we were working on Ava, and there was this Singleton template that you just inherit from Singleton, and now suddenly it's a Singleton, right? It's gotten to that point because the ideas have kind of like flowed out. But back in '99, programming in C++, it was like, oh, that's a clever way to use the language, right? Like, I never would have thought of doing that. I mean, maybe you would have, but I wouldn't have, right? So that's the advantage, obviously, of the book. So, factory method, I didn't see anything really special about it. In terms of how we often use, or how I've often used it, is just create static methods on classes for creating whatever it is that I need. So rather than going new and then going through some constructor, I will just call a static method that has all the things that I need it to do. And then the question is, well, what's the difference? Why can't you just call a constructor?
The main advantage of a factory method for me often is it sort of works like a template pattern as well, where it allows you to say, hey, let's have some extra stuff that happens when you create it. So if you need to have code which is run on lots of different things, lots of different types, but to say, hey, I created this thing, or I need to do this extra initialization code or something, you now have a place where you can do that in one spot instead of having to put it in every single constructor and then sometimes like not do it. So I know Josh and I were looking at like serialization quite a bit, and one of the things we're finding is that we can't rely upon constructors for some of this stuff, because you can't do certain things in a constructor in serialization land. Because when you're in serialization, you don't have access to some stuff, or something hasn't been built yet, and so all of these expectations of stuff that you want to run there don't work. Or maybe you can still run it, but you don't want it to run the same way when you instantiate a new copy of this to then go hook old data back into it. I don't want to like reinitialize it every time I start an old save file. I want to only, for some initialization code, only gets run the first time you find it. And so wrapping that up in a create method can make that isolated so that you can always run, here's the stuff I run the first time I need this item, but don't run during serialization.
I'm a little bit confused about what you're saying.
That was a good answer.
Because I would have thought, maybe I just misunderstood what you're saying, but like, at least that first bit about having one place where the code is, isn't that what like inheriting from other like parent classes is for, and you put that code in that constructor? That bit got a little bit lost on me, I suppose. How are those different? Is really my question.
You could do that if it's all from the same base class. You get some annoyances with the constructors in C# where you have to like start passing them around now.
Right.
Because now if you pass in the parameter at the top level, you need it everywhere.
Right.
But also it's just, you can't do that if you have two separate trees. Like if you're doing this on something like characters and monsters, if you don't have a shared base class, you don't have that option. And maybe it makes sense to add it, maybe it doesn't. But like you don't always have to say, oh, let's make it all work through the inheritance chain, because then everything all becomes one inheritance at some point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One place where I used this factory method was in the generation of gear. So there would be a sword.create and an axe.create and such, and it would go and figure out like what tier it is and pull in stats for it and whatever. And the caller doesn't care at all. It just says, hey, I need a sword, give me a sword, and it would go and figure out all that stuff. And so the factory method is parameterless, but within the constructors they have a whole bunch of parameters, because a valid instance of a sword requires a minimum hit damage and a maximum hit damage, for instance. But the factory method allows me to get away from that, right? As a caller, I'm like, I'm making a treasure table, I just need a sword. That's all I care about. Or you get into, I guess, the abstract factory, where it's like, I just need a piece of gear, and then it's going to figure out, okay, well, is it a sword, is it an armor, is it a whatever, and then it calls factory methods on those things in order to get the thing back and then give me the one thing, right? I mean, it's kind of rare for especially a procedurally generated game where the game is the GM to be like, no, I need a sword in this treasure chest, right? It's more of like, hey, you haven't had a piece of gear in 3 chests, I want to give you a piece of gear, right? Like, and I don't care what the gear is. And so I think that's an example in Archmage of those two things being used together.
Sean, I know I mentioned this last time we talked about this months ago, but I feel like the difference between abstract factory pattern and factory method is not really a difference of like thing, because abstract factory pattern oftentimes uses the factory method. Though like it's using the factory method under the hood, it's tackling a different purpose of saying, hey, let's create lots of different things of a single family. Yeah. Whereas the factory method's only focused on replacing the constructor call. Like that's its job.
Yeah. It does seem like there's an important distinction in some of it. Well, okay, I'm trying to remember how some of the data is set out. So looking at prototype, you have the same class, but you're setting different values when you clone, when you get an instance of it. I guess that our weapons axes are separate classes, but I'm trying to remember. I thought that there was something with equipment or something where you would run create and it was more prototypey, where we didn't have different subclasses, it was just different data. I could be mistaken though. I guess gems are a good example of that actually, because I think that gems, I don't think that we have, well, I guess it's just an enum on gems.
Recipes are a case of prototype. We're not talking about prototype right now, but maybe we should be. Where I only want there to be one recipe in the world. Like this is the way that you make horse bread. So great, we have horse bread, which is not made from horses for everybody. It's a very dense bread, and very grainy bread. So you have the recipe, and then everybody else just has an instance of this recipe, but they need their own instance of the recipe because what was happening when the player was going and doing something, I was making some changes on the recipe, and then it changed it for the whole rest of the world because everybody was pointing to the same instance of the recipe, and so I was like, oh, that's not going to work, and so I had to put in specific clone methods. It gets tricky where it's like, oh, that's not going to work because if I make any changes later on, it's going to screw it up. It screws up the prototype in a sense, right, for everybody. So you just do it later. But was there anything else to say about factory method?
I think kind of like related to that, near at the end of the chapter when it kind of like wraps it up, kind of like made factory method click for me because it was like, yeah, basically lots of times people will just use factory method as a starting point because it's like not quite as complicated to implement right off the bat. And then as you go, you realize, oh, actually I need something a little bit heavier duty. So then sometimes you'll use an abstract factory to like implement a set of factories and that sort of thing. So that was helpful for me.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference I've found between abstract factories and regular factories is abstract uses like an interface to create your factories, like you're interfacing your different factories, and your true factory is you're inheriting different aspects of the factory, so to speak. It's more revolved around inheritance than interfacing. At least that's from what I've gathered so far.
The best example I thought of for the factory method is when in Visual Studio you go File New, and there's a lot of choices there as far as the kind of file that you can create, text files and XML files and class diagrams and whatever, right? And so that is, what is that? That's a giant list of factory methods. They're all calling the same thing, create document. But from different factories, and then Visual Studio gets the thing back, and then it does whatever it does for displaying the thing on there. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, a little. And it helps me feel like these things aren't not relics of the past, but like abstracted away from us. Because that's kind of the impression you get when they keep talking about, oh, this framework and oh, this like Windows application, because we're not working with Windows directly like anymore. Like. So it's good to know that it does go past these like examples that they give, which are
I don't know if this helps you, Sean, but we're using the factory method in the code everywhere. More of a
yes, I had noticed that.
Okay.
I had noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going back to my earlier comment about it may not be revelatory to read these things because the Microsoft.NET framework is influenced by these design patterns because they're creating software for software developers, and so they can't just go off on their own and do like their own thing. It makes it a lot harder for us to understand, right? But if they're adhering to these patterns mostly, I don't think you have to be 100%, but they're mostly adhering to the patterns. You start reading, you're like, oh, I get what's going on here. And so if you've ever had to do any Windows Forms UI work, which why would you? But all these things come up all the time, right? When they're giving these examples of, oh, here's a shape, you need to rotate it by this amount, and so there's like a modifier of rotation, a modifier of scale. That's how the .NET UI stuff is done. It's done that way, and so it starts to make a lot of sense. But you get into Unity land, they don't do anything right. One of the fans said, "Hey, we'd be interested in Codecraft. I'd like to know more about Unity and whatever." So there's for that fan, there's the comment for Unity. So yeah, I mean you see singletons in stuff you pull off of the asset store and such, and you will see factory methods for creating things from the Unity framework, and it's just normal. Right? Kind of like you guys grew up with YouTube being like normal. That's still new to me. But like, again, like, so you're like, what's the big deal about like YouTube? I think it was Sean yesterday that was like, I didn't realize YouTube was social media. Then they're always talking about something else because you just kind of grew up with it, and it just, of course.
I mean, a great example of that is the observer pattern got baked into C#'s events.
Yeah.
The C# events are the observer pattern, and like that's just a way you can do it. And so like we now have that thing baked into the language.
It's another example of programming for others, right? So there's lots of ways of doing that to get the same solution. But hey, there's these guys with this book that a lot of people have read talking about the observer pattern, and like if I'm gonna make something, I might as well make it in a way that other people will understand, right? And then they go and implement that for their event system.
Yeah.
Okay, so prototype.
Interesting.
You
It seems a bit weird. Like we have instance creation, like object creation. Like it seems very similar to that. Just like it, the only benefit is it like perfectly clones private variables and stuff like that, or perfectly clones it. Which to me is like I don't see that many uses for it. I initially thought, well, maybe we like for items in Archmage Rises, like we have tons and tons of subclasses for every single item type that we have. Like, could we not just create an item and then clone it and for whatever variables we need, or prototype an item and stuff like that? But that doesn't really work for that either. So like, I don't particularly see the advantage of that in what we're currently doing. And maybe prefabs. I think someone mentioned last week prefabs might be a form of prototyping, but I don't know if that's really the case either.
Yeah, it is.
Is it?
It's the idea. It's the prototype idea, yeah. You're just cloning things, you're getting your own instances, and making modifications to those instances, but it still all ties back to the original. It came up today, but the first thing I wanted to ask, I thought about this when I was reading it. Tyler, can you explain the difference between a shallow and a deep copy?
A shallow and a deep copy. A shallow copy, one of them just copies the values over, and the other one copies the references over, right? Isn't that the difference?
No. Almost.
Effectively, isn't it?
No.
I would have said it slightly differently, but very similar. That like
The exact way he said it is actually really wrong.
Okay.
So, that's
So I would have said a shallow copy, would copy one level down effectively. So like any references to an object would also point to that same object. You know, obviously your primitive data types would be copies to the nature of how they actually work. But yeah, like effectively all of your data is references pointing to the same data as this. So it's a shallow copy, and it's effectively the same. Whereas a deep copy is like all the way down. For every reference, you make a copy for that every reference points to. You make a copy of that object as well.
Yes.
And that I would have interpreted as copying the values, but yeah, that's fair.
I don't know what Thomas heard, but that's what I heard Tyler say.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Tyler said for deep copy, you copy the references, but the shallow copy copies the references, right? So we have this situation in Archmage. That's what was being really particular in the words, right? He said copies the reference as opposed to making a new instance, which is what Sean said.
Oh, right.
So we had this problem in Archmage, and we have a big problem already, which is that monsters have characters inside of them. They don't inherit from character. They what is it, object composition? So we have a character inside, and that's how we manage the HP. I don't think there's anything else we gain from this stupidity. But anyways, that's what we have. So you have a monster race, like a goblin. So you have a goblin, and he has a character which stores his HP and maybe nothing else. Maybe his name as well. It gives you a first name and a last name. Okay.
You got some buffs and other stuff, but yeah.
Oh yeah, some of the buff manager stuff for it. Okay. Anyway, so you got this thing, and then so it's like, okay, well, this combat I need 3 goblins, so I'm just gonna clone the first goblin that I have 2 more times. So when you do that with a shallow copy, what happens? You have 3 goblins on the screen, and they're all sharing the same character. They all share the same HP pool. So when you attack the first one, the HP goes down. You attack the third one, this HP continues to go down because it was a shallow copy and you didn't have a new instance. And so that's why you yourself have to make these clone methods in order to do the deep copy of new instances to any references. Because if you forget one of them, then you end up in the situation where you hit any of the 3 goblins and the same HP pool is going down. And so
we actually use a factoring method instead of prototype. I mean, you don't have any of these
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why I was asking about the shallow copy, deep copy, just to make sure everybody really understood shallow copy, deep copy, because a prototype doesn't make any sense if you don't understand the deep copy solution. Like, what am I actually solving here?
I still don't really understand what it solves, but I feel like I understand how it functions. I don't understand the why again.
Well, one benefit with prototyping is that let's say that we're like, hey, okay, so we have our own, let's say that we are creating our own items and we're using an Excel spreadsheet, let's just say. And we want to go, okay, so I am going to add in a new item to this list. We don't have to create a new subclass. We can just read in the data and be like, okay, this is how we end up creating it. That's not a great example.
How is
It's
it
actually
different
inside the
from
code
just
right now.
having like a generic item, like class, and then constructors passing? I don't understand how it functions differently from just having a class where you just pass in parameters and then the class just, contains those different values. Like, I don't understand how the prototype is different from, and it might be that thing that Thomas is talking about, that object-oriented languages automatically have it baked in. But to me, it's not any different from the basic functionality of creating objects from a class definition.
So one of the differences between subclass versus prototype, one of them is just that you have a fewer name, like you have one fewer subclass. So if you're like, hey, I'm trying to, if one of the big things, so I guess what I was getting at is that at runtime you can create a new class, but it's just a different instance. It's a new prototype, in that it is now different. The data is different, but you don't need a new subclass. So one of the big benefits is that you don't have to have these all created at compilation time. You can essentially have new instances at runtime that you can have.
Yeah, I guess my confusion is a bit more like how's it different from having a goblin class and a bunch of different goblins? Like, that's where the prototype bit loses me, because it sounds the same as just the function of having a class and objects. Like, it doesn't sound different to me. Like, I don't really understand how it's different, if that makes sense.
I think it's because, like, with prototype, unlike with just changing data in a class, a prototype is like a grouped specific set of data for a class, rather than just like changing numbers around and stuff. So you have a concept of a goblin, and a goblin should have certain attack, it should have certain HP and those sorts of things. So you don't want to necessarily have to set all of those individually and remember what they are, which is what you'd have to do if you just had a monster class and then you're just trying to set it manually. Instead, you go, I want a goblin. And then I think the example in the book is there's like a registry. And so there already has like specific configuration of that class that you get back. And then that is your goblin.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah, I mean,
And
go ahead.
And I think what's really helpful for that specific thing, like, sure, go ahead, maybe you can use a constructor and pass the variables, maybe you store the variables themselves. But now what if you have private variables in that class that you can't just pull data from? And maybe those private variables are being altered somewhere in that class, right? So then why not just clone the class via the prototype? Because the prototype has those values already stored within it. So that when you create a new class, you can keep that data when you go and clone it. Because if you create a new class now, how are you supposed to now adjust those private variables outside of having separate getters and setters potentially for those variables? And so that's one of the issues if you're trying to continually create subclasses, or at least that's what I would view as an issue. Continually creating subclasses, you can't access every variable, so to speak, in that to make sure that you're cloning it perfectly across.
So you can go object equals new and the constructor, and you get a new thing. So why in the world would I ever clone? You need to remember, sometimes objects are really difficult to make. If you're streaming it across the internet and in order to get your data values to create your thing, you want to clone that. You don't want to go back to the internet and start streaming the thing again or pulling it from disk or something. So it's for complex to make objects that you've already done some work in order to get it to such a state that it's like usable. Maybe it's been registered in the world and whatever. There's like, it's hooked up to a bunch of things. So then you're like, I have this perfect thing. I just need another one of them. This idea of cloning, again, goes back to, in 1994 in C++, there is no clone method. You have to make your own. And how do you make that, or what do you call it, or whatever? It comes from this, right? It comes from, so now when we go and we look at C# and there's like a .clone, which does a member-wise copy of things. C++ has a member-wise copy thing. So this idea of having like, no, I'm going to do a deep copy, that's where it's coming from. So again, is it revelatory? No, not necessarily, but keep in mind that they're sometimes just going new class constructor. You still have a lot of work you have to do, whereas something that is already perfect and right, you can just clone it and it's good. So when you're cloning, the object knows, oh, these are my private references that I need to make deep copies of, and hopefully you don't get a cyclical reference. But I've done that. I've had that at my software company and such. So sometimes that happens, and you just have to figure it out. But anyway, that's what it's for. I was kind of getting at this. We were having a discussion, which you can't see on the whiteboard right now because the white is so high. But we were talking about our save files and new versions of the game, right? So we're going to release version 1, and then we're going to make 1.1 and 1.2, and we're just going to like continue going on. So we're going to have these updates. So we may find that we created a torch, and the torch lasts for 10 hours. But then in version 1.2, we want this torch to be 12 hours. For tuning reasons, we figured out that's like way better. The way it stands right now is if you have a new separate instance of torch and you save that everywhere, then when you load your save file from version 1 in version 1.2, all your old torches are going to be 10 hours long and your new torches will be 12 hours long. And that's not what we want. So we want a prototype, which is we want one instance of torch, and it has all the values of a torch lasts 12 hours, and then every other torch in the game is all pointing back to that original torch in order to receive its values. Because if you don't do it that way, then we end up with these crazy save state situations that become a huge mess, where the example I gave earlier was maybe we have swords and they only do 1 to 10 hit points of damage, and then when we come out with version 1.2 of the game, we bump it to 20 to 30, and then somebody loads their save game and they start playing with the new version 1.2, and all the swords are the old way, and they start complaining and saying, yeah, these swords are no good. And we're like, what? We just like tripled the damage on the things. And so you have this huge mismatch between the data and the game, the way the game is actually supposed to be. So as a rule for Archmage, going forward, we want to throw away old save data stuff and always use the latest new information, because the idea is that we've tuned it better, we've thought about it more, we're solving some kind of problem. And so you may have a sword, like we have to remember in your gear, hey, you have a sword, but now because it's version 1.2, we have to instance the sword again in order to get all the new stuff associated with it. So prototype falls within these kinds of problems.
How does prototype work, like if you do customization of the clone and then you want to pull that data again later? So for the example of the torch, let's say we have this torch, they're all like 10 hours, right, is the base in 1.1. And then for some reason you enchant this torch, now it of itself is say 14 hours long, right? And we have that stored somewhere that's in one of our inventories. And now we go to 1.2 and we change that to the base time is 12 hours. So when we go and reclone, how do you save and store that data? Hey, this one torch I have is still 14 hours, so to speak, or I enchanted it to be longer. In that sense, like that's not going to be stored in the initial prototype. That's something that's specific to that clone.
Yeah.
So how and where do you solve that issue with prototypes in that sense?
So that, go ahead.
The things I would normally think of is either a decorator pattern, which we'll get to, where you just add around it, or if you're not even doing that, you can just continue adding to it. So like you'd be adding like a buff or a boost, so you're not modifying it directly. So you're not saying, hey, let's set this value to a new value. You're saying, hey, let's increase this value by some amount. And then whatever you change to the original one is then reflected by these additions that you made to it.
Prototype isn't going to get you there, right? Like on its own, as it is. It's a starting point. So the concept of having a prototype thing from which you're cloning gives you a starting point, and you're like, hey, I want to do these additional things. Now you're going into new functionality that you have to build for. So that's when you see in the game that we're like, hey, what is the stat? Because the stat for your run speed comes from your boots, and it comes from your dexterity, and it comes from like a whole bunch of things, right? It's like all over the place. We have to like gather all that up. So in this torch case, we're like, how long are you? It has to be smart and go, okay, well, the base is this, and then these are the buffs or whatever that are added to in order to give back that final answer. And so it's on a case-by-case basis, but prototype is the start of, don't just have individual instances of things. Okay. You can like connect them up and clone from them, and then what you do with that is where you go.
Yeah, okay. And so that's kind of why current, like I don't particularly see it, but the current item system in Archmage isn't prototype based, is it? Like
no, it's not
items.
No.
I can't think of anything in Archmage that's prototype based.
No, because I didn't read this chapter till now.
But I guess even having read it now, like I'm not certain where I would want to use it, except in like cases like Thomas was talking about, where it's you're handling internet connections, and you're like, oh, I don't need to go and do something else with this. I can just use what's already there. Mm-hmm. But in general, it feels like it'll take about as long to clone as it will to just grab a new one, especially for simple things.
With the recipes, the clone, I did the clone method. I'd have to go back and look at the source code as to why, but there was an advantage. The answer is when it's a complex to create the instance. There was some work associated, that's when you clone.
I can imagine like if you have some sort of calculation to get like an answer that takes a while, then cloning is going to be way faster than going through that every time. So I don't know what that is, but maybe like, you know, a dungeon or something might be, you know, figuring out where rooms go. That might take quite a long time to execute. In our case it doesn't, but it could in theory. It might be easier to clone and modify a dungeon than it is to start from scratch. Like maybe not the best example, but something like that I think would make sense for a prototype. Especially where you're in initialization, you have to do a lot of calculating. I think that helps me understand a lot better as to why you use it.
To get closer to the metal, if you were working on DirectX or OpenGL or something, you have to deal with this situation all the time, because when you create a new instance of a texture, you got to pull it across the RAM, across the bus. But if it's already there inside the RAM of the GPU, you clone it, you're like, oh, it's here again. I mean, I don't know why you have two of the exact same texture, but anyway, it's again, there's like a cost factor to instancing, and then that's where you use prototype. And you're like, well, how often does that come up? Apparently never. in working on Archmage.
Okay, so I'm curious how this plays into like something like object pooling, right? So with object pooling, you just have these existing objects that you're using, and so it sounds like you can almost use that in the same way here as a prototype, and you're just tweaking those objects to be what you need it to be anyway.
That's exactly what I was thinking of in terms of doing particles. You're doing object pooling, and you're just like cloning these things, because creating a new particle from scratch and having the texture you actually, in the case of a particle, you want only one texture defined and like 100,000 things all pointing to it, right? You don't want individual instances. And so again, that's where cloning gives you that. Whereas I guess you could create new particle and then pass in the texture as a parameter, but again, it's putting more reliance on the caller to know that. Whereas if you just do clone, then you take care of knowing those things, and the caller, the client doesn't have to care anymore.
And that sounds like a madman's idea of like, you know, having 100,000 times and making sure the parameter gets passed in and that's the right parameter, and yeah, let's just clone it and make it easy on ourselves.
Yeah.
We use a flywheel pattern. I feel like that's
It
working
was-
with particles.
Maybe.
Quit jumping ahead in patterns.
Yeah, I was gonna say it reminds me of the flyweight pattern
Yeah.
with how graphics is rendered. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Anything else on prototype? Then let's never speak of it again. Okay, Singleton. You might have anything to say about Singleton?
We should never-
It's used
Actually,
all
yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
Something new clicked for me this time.
Really?
The book was talking about like how one of the advantages of Singleton is that it allows you to change your mind if you're like, actually, I don't want this to be an instance, and then you can do something else with it. And then I remembered what Josh and Michael had to do with saving and loading with the game. How they're like, actually, it's pretty good if we have another version that we can be loading, and then swap that in. And I was like, oh, we actually did change our mind. Whereas before I was just like, I don't understand when you would ever need to do that or how that's useful. So yeah, that's cool for me.
By change your mind, you mean like create a new instance of the class for your current use case?
Yeah, you can be like, I
You
don't
just have
actually want to
self-construction.
necessarily have only one version anymore. I want to be able to have two. Since you're interfacing with it through a method, you can change how that works so that it isn't necessarily enforcing a single one anymore.
Yeah, that was something I hadn't seen where it's like, oh, maybe we want two instances of this everywhere. We can control it to be like, we always want two. That's never a thought I've ever had.
Yeah.
I still don't know exactly what the use is on that, but I'm like, well, that's interesting. Your singleton can be a
Dualton?
dualton?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, what if you only want one sun, but then you realize you're in like a double sun star system or something, then you want two suns?
Yeah.
It's a Star Wars reference. They live on a planet with two
Yes.
suns.
It's actually more common to have a binary star system than a singular star.
Really?
It
Yeah.
is.
Oh,
It
wow.
is.
Tatooine's the norm, not
Yeah.
really.
Isn't that weird? So
That
weird.
is weird.
Yeah. I'm glad Codecraft ended in a discussion about Star Wars.
What I want really know is, I want to hear about the anti-pattern, as some unnamed member of our squad put it, referring to Singletons. So,
Talking about Raoul. Because I know Raoul was like,
no, I thought you referred to it as an anti-pattern. Maybe that's overstating them.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm not a fan, but I'm not here to knock down Singleton right now. We're here
well,
to
I'm just curious as to.
This is Singleton's time to shine, okay? You don't
Oh,
need to
okay.
disparage
Yeah,
it.
No, I'm trying to understand though, like, because obviously it offers a lot. Like that's my understanding the way you use it, and I'm trying to, because I can think of lots of reasons to use it, but I don't know why people are anti it. I suppose is my sort of question around it. Like, it seems really useful, and like we use it all the time, and like. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I can't conceptualize why it would be bad. And that's why I was curious about it.
I have the exact same feeling, and when I watched one of the Unity keynote talks about, what are those, scriptable objects, and how you get rid of singletons by using scriptable objects and blah, 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 and the guy was all slamming on singletons and stuff. What I concluded after listening to him was people are using it wrong. So what he's
Yeah.
fed up with is people using singleton wrong.
Yeah.
In the wrong places. Like that's not the solve. You did that because it was easy, but that's
Yeah.
not the actual solve.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with Singleton. There's something wrong with the programmers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the problem does not exist in Singleton.
I'm glad to hear that, because that's kind of my feelings as well.
Good. High five.
I think that, I mean, whenever there's complaints...
Michael doesn't want to engage.
I think the biggest thing that I always just look at is what are your goals and what's the best way to accomplish them. Because usually when there's a complaint, it's, this doesn't help me with my goals, and somebody else is like, I've got different goals. Why doesn't this solve your problem right? Look at my goals. Like, those aren't my goals. And so I think that in a lot of cases, the kind of fights that can break out over different patterns, I'm not saying that we're having fights here, I'm just saying when there are, I mean, I've seen some keynotes where people are like dropping F-bombs left and right because they're so upset about what people are doing with their code. But the thing is that in a lot of cases, I think that it can go down to what are your goals. And sometimes somebody is doing something that they're like, I want to do this, and it's not helping them solve their goals, and then it's like, okay, like that's not. But I think that that's a common thing. Is it's like, here are my goals, here are my goals. We disagree on the pattern because we have different goals, and so it doesn't make sense for us to do the same thing because goals are different.
So Thomas, I'm curious what you would think of how would you use singletons wrong? Because I feel like the reason they
I never have. I can't answer that question.
I mean, I can think
well,
of
so the reason they get paid is because essentially it's a pattern that's saying, hey, let's not use global variables. Oh, but we're going to create a global variable.
Yeah.
And so all the problems that you have with global variables of interconnectedness and this thing now always exists everywhere is all the problems people with singletons. So if you're using them all the time in lots of different ways, I can see it very easily getting into a place where it's very hard to work with. And that was my experience on Ava. I felt like our singletons on Ava, besides not even being singletons, because they didn't always, there was no existence of them always having one or even them existing. But it also just, we had so many of them in so many places, it was very hard to get stuff done sometimes. But
I don't understand that statement. I don't know how a Singleton makes it hard to do something because it's a always referenceable from anywhere class that you can read and write data from or like call methods on or something. Like how does that get in the way of what it is that you're trying to do?
I mean, one of the things that comes to mind that can happen is, hey, is this a singleton or not? Like, there's not, I don't see a common nomenclature, and maybe it's just because we're not using it, of, hey, this is a singleton.
It's
so
dot instance. Dot instance tells you it's a...
Yeah, but what I mean is that, let's say that I'm just like, hey, I want to access the controller for health. And I don't necessarily inherently know that it's a singleton or not. I have to go there and I have to find it. So I'm like typing in, okay, and one of the things that I've also seen is where there are both singletons and references to the singletons, in which case that's a whole mess, where it's like, hey, we've got this master controller that's referencing a singleton. Like, it's storing it as a field. It's storing this reference to a singleton as a field, which in my mind, it's like, if you're doing that, you should just be using dot instance throughout instead. So I've seen some mixtures of that as well, where, okay, you can call this with dot instance,
Actually, that's a good point.
but you can also go into this other class where it's stored as HUD controller and grab it that way, and it's using both throughout the code base, which that's an issue of use.
Yeah, because if you store the
both of those.
reference... Okay.
I would consider that more of an issue of use.
Yeah, it's an
Yeah.
issue of use.
I mean, another thing that comes to mind is just you need to make sure that if you're creating a bunch of data, like you're creating a huge cache on a singleton, you really need to make sure that you clear that out at some point. So that's the other thing that comes to mind. Is it's like, okay, if you don't actually want this cache to always be available or this data, you need to make sure that you have some system for clearing it. And singleton, by default, obviously you can make ways to clear it out, so it's not like you can't, but by default it doesn't have that because it's this static value that is connected to it. So you just need to make
If
sure
you're flushing your singleton, you're doing it wrong. Like you said, it's not a singleton anymore.
I mean, there are places where that's what we've got going on in Archmage, where it's like, well, we want to, like for example, the game instance. Game has been a singleton for a long time, but
Yeah.
it's not supposed to exist on the title screen.
well, right now game is not a singleton.
Yeah, it's not.
A singleton. You might, it still sort of feels like a singleton the way it's being referred to, but it is no longer a singleton.
Why?
Because we need to be able to have a game instance while we are saving out a game instance, or we need to be able to load in game data and have that act upon itself, or have it just load in data without being set onto a singleton. So we might need to be able to, we've run into cases where we had to work with the game instance and also not have it be running as a singleton. With our
I'll take your word for that. I don't understand, but I'll take your word for it.
Game went from being the thing which was always available, always persistent, and you could use it as sort of like this thoroughfare from like anything could go through a game and access the data, to now game is just the current game state. And so there's places in the game where the current game state doesn't make sense.
Right.
Before you've loaded, after
Right.
you're loading, while you're loading. Like there's pieces where that game state is no longer the same, or it's not even accessible. So that's why I say it's not a singleton.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I feel like Michael's question from before wasn't fundamentally addressed, which was like, I guess in essence, like the whole point of what we're doing is encapsulation, and singletons seem to somewhat defy that by being accessible everywhere. And so why and this is maybe the question about the anti-pattern idea, is like singletons just like because it's easier, it's an easy way to have access to all the data, and we haven't thought hard enough about a structure which is more encapsulated, or are they necessary, for want of a better way to put it?
I don't think singletons violate encapsulation. The singleton encapsulates whatever it needs to encapsulate. So the fact that it's accessible from anywhere else in the application doesn't violate encapsulation.
But it does introduce it there. When you use singletons heavily, it ties a lot of stuff to that singleton. So anything in the game that's using game.instance is now tied to game.instance. So if we swap out game.instance with something else, it's no longer usable. And so most of the complaints I've heard tend to come down to reuse. And so it's not encapsulation in terms of like purpose, but it's encapsulation in terms of reusability and porting to other games, which we just don't care about.
I can think of a very good example in Maple where we were running into issues with singletons. So one of the things that had happened was that levels were made into a singleton. And so you had level.instance. Now that seems fine in general, until you have a level generator where you want to have several levels in the same scene that someone can just take and plop into another spot. Suddenly we can't store these values as separate if we are looking for example, hey, where are all the enemies in this scene? They're taken at this top level instead of in the individual levels that we've generated. And so it caused it, I got it working without too much trouble, but it is something where if we've got any remnants of those sitting around, people are going to run into errors or into weird stuff going on.
Oh, I think that leads into what Thomas was saying though, that it's the use of it rather than it fundamentally. And maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
Well, and the issue there is, in some cases, figuring out, is this a good case to use this? And in some cases, it's just being like, this is, and now it's not, and then you change it.
Sure, you definitely, in that case, had a changed goal.
Yeah.
Right? You were like, oh, now I gotta do level generator, and I gotta generate 5 levels at once, right? Like, there was a total change. But like on Ava, we didn't have a singleton for a level. I would never do that, because levels can change. But
You did have a singleton per level.
we had it on and off of the game. The game would have a level.
There was a singleton on game, there was a singleton on level, there was a singleton on stage, and none of them were true singletons, so there was a lot of, and it doesn't matter.
Anyway, so something like level is something that, changes, like this level, next level, previous level, or whatever. So that would be something that would be instanced off of, say, game.
But what really makes sense here isn't really for level to be a singleton, it's for like a level manager or something. So it's the thing that you're going to run the level, because you're only ever going to want one level. Until Josh tells me, hey, we're trying to test multiple scenes simultaneously at once, and then you're like, well, I don't know what to do with that. But like, it's still for a thing where you only want one thing. That's sort of in the name.
So things that make good singletons are the Unity like scene manager, right? When you're like, close out this scene, fade out this scene, and bring in this one. Usually a UI, because you only ever have one UI, and again the fading and whatever that goes along with that. Master audio is a singleton. because it needs to exist across scene files so that the sound is still playing and whatnot. You can't have two instances of it. The input controller, so for your actual controllers, right? So you only want one of those in existence that is then connected to your keyboard, game controllers, etc.
Do you only want one input controller? Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, because say you've got like 4 controllers, right?
The 4 controllers are all registered under the one input controller.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and you have to like search out and find them when you like start up the game. You know, like what controllers are plugged in, and then when somebody starts moving it, you can detect movement on it. Whenever you don't want 4 instances of your input controller, because the keyboard and the controller are essentially mapped to the same key in a sense, right? Where you press A on there, you press Control on your keyboard, like it's coming through as the same input and the game's responding. So you want all your input at the same level so that the game can respond accordingly.
One question that I have with singletons in general, and I did see the use case that they had where they're like, hey, you can have a singleton and it can set itself to a different child class. So then it's like, okay, well, we want to have one instance and it's this. But why would we use a singleton over just a bunch of static methods and static fields and static properties on a static class? That's something I haven't been sure about.
Great question. You covered it in the book.
Yeah, I remember reading about it, I just don't remember what he said.
Yeah, that's exactly what he covered. And he said, because there's a lot of things that you get through. So first of all, if you did those static things, you can't do any inheritance off of it. If you have a static method of load, that's it. That's all you're getting. Whereas if you have a singleton, you have an instance of game, and now you can have load game from a stream from the web, load game from like cloud save, load game from whatever.
I guess that
you can override.
Inside of my kind of question there, so there's I see cases where we know that we aren't inheriting, and I guess that's where it's like, well, maybe you just want to have that there just to be sure. But there's certain systems where it just seems like, okay, we know this is the only level of singleton, and that's been the majority of situations that I've seen for Archmage, is that when we have a singleton, we're not inheriting from the singleton anywhere. I'm not even sure if we have any case where a singleton is being inherited from. So
one potential where you might want inheritance with singletons would be like if you want to do some stubbing out for testing. So like if you don't actually want it to go do stuff, you could swap it out with a test version of it, or a log version of it, or something like that. So you still have the same interface, but you have new functionality because we don't have that functionality yet, or because we just need to test it in isolation and it takes too much effort to run the network query we need to run or whatever.
If I understand that right, how's that different from, say, like having interfaces and stubbed out, like a stub version of an interface for the singleton? Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying there.
I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, so I don't know.
Yeah, so what you said is that having like a class that handles that stuff is better because you can swap in a stubbed version, right? That's effectively what you're saying.
Oh.
And I was wondering, how is that different from using, maybe they're similar or something, but having an interface and swapping in a stubbed version, like.
I think those are the same.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
you could just inherit from, or like you're still having the same API that you're referencing. So. Yeah.
So Josh's question, if we had game just as a whole bunch of static methods, so we have get gold or take damage or something like that, when you go to load a game versus making a new game, all those things is really, really hard. If it's not impossible, it's really hard in order to like get rid of what you currently have in order to get the new thing in. But because it is an instanced object, you can throw it away real easy. You can just say instance equals null. Okay, it's gone. And then you can load it from a file or create it from the world generator, and you get exactly the same thing. And the game doesn't care. It just continues on.
Yeah, I mean, but I also had the impression from what you were saying before that if you're ever getting rid of a singleton, then you're using singletons wrong. So even though you're citing that,
If you have to regularly flush, because you said, "Hey, I have the Singleton and it's caching a whole bunch of data, and it gets so big that I'm going to want to flush it away at some time,
sorry.
like garbage collection or something." Like, it's the wrong solution. If that you wouldn't never use a Singleton for something that's going to like grow, and then I'm going to get rid of half of it.
Sure. So sorry. The kind of context that I was imagining with that is that you're playing through the game. You have a cache that's relevant while you're in gameplay mode. Then you return to the title screen and you empty it, because you don't want those values anymore, or maybe they even changed from gameplay session. So.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, that was the kind of context that I was thinking of. I wasn't thinking of something where it's like every 5 minutes you're clearing it out or something like
Yeah.
that.
It's good that we define terms. Okay, well, we've come up to an hour. Any further thoughts on how awesome Singleton is and that we should put it everywhere?
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
We better go change a bunch of
Start with
Never
a-
use that wrong.
Start with a Singleton, and then if you need to, change it to something else.
What was it? Jilton. You're like, oh,
Yeah, I mean, in general, I've been just reading across forums, seeing what other people are thinking about singletons, and the general assumption is that it's a global coupling to that class, causing modifications to it to be difficult to make sure it works across your project.
It's interesting though, because I feel like that's where that subclass thing that they talked about is doable. So it's not that different than having an interface, which is kind of that thing as well, you know?
It really depends on what they're making.
I think
Yeah.
the problem there is still that the interface, or not, the Singleton just becomes a behemoth normally. Like it
Yeah.
just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, sure, yeah, you can subclass it, but now you have to define all of these pieces for all these different bits.
Yeah, I was more thinking like, for example, the Unity scene manager, and then if, for example, for some reason they wanted to do like a multiplayer version, I don't know why you'd have that, but like you can subclass it and, you know, throw, like, because it's an instance, as long as it's of the type of that class, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, like it can, all the same methods can still be used, the interface is the same basically. So I can see a lot of value in the Singleton and doing it that way versus the static, just having static stuff. So yeah.
By the way, a general strat, if you're ever looking for counter opinions on something that you like, you just type in why thing sucks. Lots of people's opinions.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good stuff. We'll see you all next week.
See ya.
Oh, what are we covering next week?
I think we're actually sticking around, Zach. I think you were saying that's for our recording.